Yeah, great. Thanks everyone for coming to the Law Faculty's Visiting Speaker Series. I'm very happy to present David Owens from the Philosophy Department at the University of Reading, who will be speaking to his paper, Wrong by Convention. Handout of the paper, or rather, copies of the handout associated with the paper have been circulated. If you don't have one, just put up your hand and Martha will be able to circulate a copy to you. David's agreed to speak for approximately 40 minutes, leaving us approximately another 40 minutes for Q&A. I'll be taking down names, so if you do have a question, please just put up your hand when we get to that stage. Thanks very much. Over to you, David.
I predicted I'd speak for 40 minutes, which is different than agreeing. Anyway, so thanks. So there was a paper circulated, and I'm not going to talk about the last section of the paper on promising. If anyone wants to talk about that in the discussion, that'd be great. But so I'm going to concentrate on the first three sections of the paper. So I start the paper with a discussion of distinction familiar to criminal lawyers between mala in se and mala prohibita. What I try to do is to set up that distinction in my own way, and also to extend it to non-legal prohibitions, to social prohibitions, and in particular to those characteristic of family life. So let me start by saying what my take on this distinction is. So the mala in se, things like rape and murder, the law prohibits them. And part of the reason the law prohibits them is because they are wrong prior to the legal prohibition. So that's the idea. So murder and rape are wrong prior to being legally prohibited, and that's part of the reason why they're legally prohibited. It's not the whole reason. There are things which many people think wrong prior to being prohibited, like lying and adultery, which are not legally prohibited on the whole because of the undesirable consequences of so doing. So the wrongness, the intrinsic wrongness of the thing is not the only consideration relevant to whether it should be prohibited, but it's an important part of the story of why it is prohibited by the law. Social prohibition is justified in part by reference to the pre-conventional wrongness. Now, I want to leave it open how that justification goes, whether it's a retribution or whether it's the law's expression of social revulsion at the thing. Lots of stories are consistent with that idea. So that's mala in se. The category of mala prohibita, these are wrongs, things which are wrong only once they are prohibited. So things like parking in the wrong place, not paying your taxes, not showing up for the draft and serving in the army, not accepting legal tender. These are wrongs, and people are blamed for them, rightly so, but only once they have been, in some of these cases, legally prohibited. And again, I want to extend the class of mala prohibita to social prohibition as well, where you'll be excluded from polite society if you throw your child out of the house at the age of 16 or something like that. You'll be blamed, and something unpleasant will happen to you. So these are acts wrong only once prohibited, and acts now this is a standard kind of story where the social prohibition is justified by the desirable consequences of that prohibition. So we prohibit people from keeping all their income or refusing to accept legal tender because such prohibitions have desirable consequences which outweigh the costs of prohibiting, and the prohibitions are justified when they do outweigh the costs of prohibiting. Now here a desirable consequence can be, and that phrase brings to mind utilitarian considerations like social welfare, but I want to broaden it to include anything whose desirability does not depend on the wrongness of the thing prohibited. Right? So it can include considerations of justice, the ability to maximise the respect for rights, or something like lots of stuff can go into desirable consequences, as long as the desirability of the thing does not depend on the prior wrongness of the thing you're prohibiting. And then you get a distinction from mala in se. So that's how I'm setting up the thing to start with. Okay, so now I want to focus on two features of the standard examples of mala prohibita that distinguish them from mala in se, beyond what I've already said. The first thing is when you're dealing with a mala prohibita, there is no virtue in prohibition. there is no value in the prohibition beyond the desirable consequences, the desirable social consequences of the prohibition. So, for instance, if there's various ways of regulating the flow of traffic in a modern society, or the parking system. You can ban people from going in certain areas. You can sell a license for them or impose a charge for going in certain areas. And if you can get the desirable, whatever the desirable state of traffic flow or the desirable parking arrangements are, by giving people incentives or selling licenses rather than prohibiting, then there's no case for prohibiting. The case for prohibiting is simply an instrumental thing. So the bet happens to be the best way of getting the prohibition-independent result that you want. So on many views, though not on all, for instance, there's no virtue in having a conscription. The issue is simply, how do we get the best army that we need? If you can do it without conscription, then that's great. You just pay some people to go and serve in the army. Not everyone thinks that, but that's a widespread view. Right. Whereas, you can see the contrast with Mahler and say there, if it's a rape or a murder, many people would think, there's a value in prohibiting, which comes from the awfulness of the thing prohibited. And there may be various stories about that, retribution, expression of revulsion, but lots of people will think there is virtue in prohibition there. The only adequate way to respond to that thing is with a prohibition. The second feature of Mahler prohibitor I want to draw attention to is to do with the who is primarily wronged when you commit a Mahler prohibitor. So when I don't pay my taxes or I don't show up to serve in the army, it's quite likely I'm not wronging any individual, actually. I'm not playing my part in the system, which we assume is a desirable form of social organisation. So perhaps I'm wronging everyone who does play their part, but there's probably no individual person who is wronged by what I'm doing. There are cases of Mahler prohibitor where someone may well be wrong. So, for instance, if the taxi driver refuses to give me a lift because I don't have the local currency, because he wants dollars, and I only have the local currency, I may be greatly inconvenienced by that. And in which case I'm wrong, so presuming he's obliged to accept the local currency. But I'm wronged in virtue of another fact, which is that it's wrong for him not to accept the local currency. Right? So the wrong to me is a derivative wrong, and a wrong which may not occur at all. If I'm not inconvenienced by it, if I happen to have dollars, then I'm not wrong. Right? So there we explain the wrong to the individual as a byproduct of the fact that there's a social wrong, conventional wrong to do with the system, and the system's a good thing and he ought to participate in it. And it so happens that I'm inconvenienced by his breach. So there's a derivative wrong there. Whereas, if you think of paradigm Mahler and say, okay, so the law bans murder, and perhaps because of that, if you do kill someone, you haven't just wronged the victim, you've wronged everyone because you're upsetting social order, and the state will think you lèse-majesté, or whatever the legal term is. But the primary wrong is against the victim. And that's why it's banned, because you have this primary wrong. If you kill someone, you wrong them. And the law is coming in to recognise that fact or respond to it. So you have this individual wronging relationship, which you don't necessarily have and don't fundamentally have in the Mahler prohibitor case. Okay, so those are two features to bear in mind of paradigm Mahler prohibitor, which seem to distinguish them from Mahler in se. Now there are some complex cases, and we need to go into this in order to do the discussion of family life. So there are some cases where Mahler there are Mahler in se which might look like Mahler prohibitor. So I just want to look at two of them. The first I call context-dependent Mahler in se. So this is a case where whether you committed a Mahler in se depends on what other people actually do or are actually disposed to do. So it might look as if it's a function of the social context, and therefore might look like a Mahler prohibitor, but it's not. So say someone is injured on the street, and say, as is plausible, I have some kind of natural pre-legal obligation to help them, so I'm wronging them if I don't. But suppose it so happens that there's lots of people around who are happy to help them. Perhaps they, hope they'll get mentioned in the person's will. Perhaps they think they're trying to impress their girlfriend, or whatever it is. Whatever reason they have, it's a fact that I'm surrounded by people who are happy to take this person to hospital. well then it seems to me I'm not obliged to take them to hospital. No, it's not about, as long as they get to hospital and I know they're going to get to hospital, it doesn't matter that I'm the guy to take them to hospital. So here there's a potential marler in say, but it disappears if we are surrounded by people who, for whatever reason, are happy to discharge the obligation. It's different if the reason they feel obliged to discharge the obligation is because they feel it's part of a worthwhile social system. So they're not trying to impress their girlfriend, they're not trying to get into the guy's will, they don't find it fun to go to hospital. If they're only doing it because there's some social rule that, it's like, if it's like the case of serving in the army, for instance, where there's no prestige in serving in the army, people don't want to do it, they only do it out of obligation, then I may be obliged to show up and serve in the army, even if that won't make much difference to the efficiency of the army. So that's a different kind of case, that's the genuine moral prohibition. But that's where people are being motivated by conscientious adherence to the valuable social system. It's different from the case of the guy who's injured on the road, where lots of people want to help him for their own reasons. Okay. So that's the context-dependent marler in se. They look like marler prohibitor, but they're not. The second kind of marler in se I'll call a conventionally specified marler in se. So this is a case where we start off with what you might think of as a natural duty, let's say the duty to help someone who's been attacked by an aggressor in the street. As long as you can do so without threat to your life and all the usual qualifications. And there, regardless of the law, you'd be wronging the person if you didn't help them and help defend them, because you can easily do so. Now, the law may come along and not just recognise that fact, but tell you how to do it, i.e. conventionally specify or narrow the pre-conventional obligation. So the law can say, for good reasons, you should call the police. You shouldn't step in and wade in and do it yourself. And there's obvious marler prohibitor type reasons for having such a rule. So there what you've done is you started off with a marler in se and you've narrowed it or specified it because of social welfare or whatever, marler prohibitor type considerations. But fundamentally what you have is a marler in se. So if you don't help them at all, you've wronged them. But if you help them but don't summon the police, then you've committed a marler prohibitor, which probably may not wrong them at all, but if it wrongs anyone, probably wrongs people in general, because you've contributed to a certain level of social disorder or some such thing. So that's another case which might look at the first side as a marler prohibitor, because the law's coming in and doing something, but when you look at it, it's really a marler in se at bottom, and there's a marler prohibitor element on the sides. Okay, so there's the distinction, which I hope corresponds approximately to the thing that you find in criminal law, or the discussions you find in criminal law, and there's some complications. And what I want to argue is, even with the complications and the idea there might be mixed wrongs and all sorts of issues, you won't be able to deal with a rather broad and prominent class of social wrongs. You won't be able to explain how they work. So you need to do something else over and beyond the complexities that I've just introduced in order to deal with those kinds of wrongs. And in particular, you need to introduce the idea that a convention or a social prohibition might be desirable for its own sake, but not just because of its desirable consequences. And then you'll be able to do the job. And I haven't introduced that idea yet. The whole thing's been set up without that idea. So this is the idea that social prohibition is not to be justified either by reference to the desirable consequences of the prohibition or by reference to the awfulness of the thing prohibited. Neither of those two things is going to do the work. So you need a third thing, namely that the convention is desirable, quite apart from the other two things. That's the idea. Okay, so there are lots of bits of human social life I think that idea is relevant to, and as I say, there's a section on promising, which I'm not going to talk about, but for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to focus on familial obligations, the obligations people have in virtue of the fact that the person is their parent or their child. So here, I'm going to start by distinguishing between two kinds of familial obligations in such a way as to enable me to avoid the really interesting issues here. So the really interesting issues, of course, are why we ought to have a family structure at all. Why isn't Plato right? Why shouldn't we just dole out our children to the public nursery, or show up once a week to take care of, feed the babies or whatever? And I'm not going to talk about that, I'm afraid. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just distinguish between two kinds of obligations which I call core and non-core familial obligations. The core ones are the ones that have to be socially recognised if a society is to have a structure, a family structure at all. So they wouldn't be recognised in Plato's Republic. There's no family structure there. I mean, there are people are born and have parents in that sense, but there isn't a normative structure of family life. They rear their children without dealing with family structures. And I'm not going to say what goes into that core, it's just one of those, it's like the elephant, you recognise it when you see it. You know the difference between the person being brought up in an orphanage and the person being brought up by adopted parents, for instance. The latter's a family structure, the former isn't. And almost all human societies deal with the problem of distributing the costs of rearing their young and to a great extent caring for their elderly by reference to a family structure. That seems to be a fact about human beings. And unfortunately, I'm not going to explain that. I'm just going to take it for granted. What interests me is not that constant fact, it's the very variable periphery or penumbra to family obligations, which is in fact the bulk of family obligation. The kinds of obligations which are recognised in many human societies, but they vary a lot from society to society, and they're not essential to having a family structure. And there's a huge mass of material here. I'm just going to focus on one particular issue, which is how long parents ought to care for their children and how long children ought to care for their elderly parents. Right? That's that. I'm just going to focus on the norms, the social norms governing those issues, and how the burdens of family life ought to be distributed. And what I'm going to do is that, so I think those obligations generate wrongs of disloyalty, and I'm going to try and treat them as Marlowe and say, treat them as Marlowe and prohibitor. It's not going to work. So, and then I'm going to try and introduce an alternative proposal. So, here's some sociological assertions. Where I come from, you are wronging your daughter if you throw her out of the house at 16 in order to save on the food bill so you can go on world cruises and live it up. Right? That is wronging your daughter. That's a wrong of disloyalty. She will resent it. She will seek forgiveness, all the usual stuff. Okay? If you put your parents in a rest home because you can't be bothered to mow their lawn for them, you are wronging your parents, where I come from. That's a serious wrong of disloyalty. They will be very upset, and so on and so forth. But these things are very variable. So let's call the society I described British, and let's call another society Italian, right? And in Italian society, you are obliged to give your adult children a home until marriage, until they married, and you are obliged to provide your parents and in-laws with a home in your own house until they need grave medical care. Right? Now that, I understand Italy is somewhat similar to that in certain respects, and certainly we can imagine a society quite similar to our own, which is like that, where people have those obligations, and where it would be a serious disloyalty to throw your 23-year-old son out of the house when there was no immediate prospect of marriage, in setting up his own house. I think that is actually the situation in Italy, but maybe people can correct me on that. So clearly a lot of cultural variation here. And that leads you naturally to think that we're dealing with mala prohibita here. That what's going on is there are certain social burdens here, caring for young people, caring for elderly people, and the British and the Italians are taking a different view about how those burdens should be distributed. And if we're being charitable, we may suppose that there are good reasons for them taking a different view. So in England, perhaps the British economy is more lively and productive than the Italian economy. There isn't 50% youth unemployment or whatever. So throwing people out of the house at the age of 18, where it's permissible, I think, is okay, whereas in Italy it's all rather different, and you can't do that. So you might think there's some demographic, social, economic explanation for why there should be this difference. But that's the natural. I suppose that's the natural way to go in the case of in the face of such social variation. Is to think it's like having a tax system or having a conscription system, where there's a costs and benefits. We all need to bring up our children and to care for our elderly. We as a nation, And we just have to decide how to distribute those burdens and benefits. And given the difference in the Italian economy and the British economy, this is the sensible way to do it. But that seems to miss something, just intuitively. But because the way people think about their obligations to pay for their kids' college education or whatever it might be, or to keep their parents and mow their parents' lawn, they don't think of it like that. Right? They think of it as a personal bond, a bond of loyalty, as I put it, between them and their parents. And it's not like not paying your taxes or not accepting legal tender, where you may inconvenience someone, but there's not a disloyalty there. It's not about you and them primarily. It's about you not playing your part in this system, which is a useful system to have. With parents and children, it's about you. It's about you and your daughter, or you and your mother. So there's something missing from this way of thinking about it, as if it's the tax system or some kind of queuing system or something like that. And one way to get at that is to look at those two features, remind ourselves of those two features of paradigm mala prohibita. First, there's no virtue in prohibition. It's just instrumental. Prohibition is the most convenient way of doing it. That's great. If it's not, there's nothing to be said for it. And it doesn't seem quite like that in family life. These bonds of loyalty don't seem to have purely instrumental value. It's not purely a matter of the efficient distribution of the burdens of childcare in society as such. There seems to be more to it than that, more value in them than that. And secondly, if you don't do what you're obliged to do with your mother or your child, you've wronged them primarily. They're the first person you've wronged. So if I throw my daughter out of the house at 16 to live it up on world cruises, the first person I should apologise to when I realise what a bastard I've been is her. Right? So she's the. Now it may be she went and went to the social security office or went to the relatives or something, and there was a burden on them, and that was a burden I should have borne. In which case, no doubt, I should apologise to them as well. But it would be perverse to go first to them and then to her. Right? She's the primary focus of the wronging, and then it's like rape and murder. It's more like that. It's not like legal tender and taxation and the draft and all that kind of stuff. So those two features of paradigm mala prohibita don't seem to be present here. There is virtue in prohibition, and the wronging is primarily when you breach, the wronging is primarily a wronging of the individual, of some individual, not of the system. It's not that you're not playing your part. You may not be playing your part in the system, but that's not the primary phenomenon. Okay. So now we've tried to treat these wrongs as mala prohibita, and we've got into difficulties. So let's try and treat them as mala in se instead. And let's you make use of those complications I signalled earlier. I mean, they're not they're not like rape and murder, but there's too much cultural variation for that. But perhaps we can accommodate that with the idea, for instance, that they're a context-dependent mala in se. Right? So we have that idea that in certain circumstances, you might be obliged to help someone, but if everyone else is happy to help, then you're not obliged to help them anymore. So perhaps it's like that with Britain and Italy. Perhaps, given the objective economic situation in Italy, Italian boys and girls just need a home until marriage, whereas this is not the case in Britain. So it's like the guy who needs help on the road. Well, I doubt that. I mean, I doubt the facts stack up to that and would make sense of that. But even if they would, there would be something missing, which is, remember, in the hospital case, it doesn't matter who gives the help. Right? So as long as the guy gets to hospital, that's the important thing. And if the situation is such that he's not going to get to hospital unless you help him, then you've got to help him. But your helping him doesn't really come into it except as an occasion. But that's not like that with family life. It's not that Italian parents think, oh well, my son needs a home until marriage, and as long as someone provides, that's great. It doesn't have to be me. On the contrary, this crucial part of it that they should do the providing. Right? This is the bond between them. So the fact that the state would provide a public housing for all unmarried Italian sons or something, is neither here nor there. They want to do it themselves. That's part of the deal. It's part of the nature of the bond. So that doesn't help, that analogy. It's not a context-dependent mala in se. So what about conventionally specified morals? Say, could it be that, you know, there's this sort of vague and general obligation to do right by your children, which we all have regardless of the society we live in. And then these different societies get to specify that obligation in various ways. Could that be what's going on? Well, again, I mean, I don't think the analogy won't be convincing. I mean, in the case I used, where you're obliged to summon the police, you have a definite obligation to help the person who's been attacked, to defend them. And the state is coming in and saying, look, you ought to do this in a certain way, for good, moral, or prohibited type reasons. And there it is plausible to say that it's the same obligation, they're just telling you how to do it. That's a plausible thing to say. It's not plausible to think that if a British person was suddenly transported to Italy, that the way they think of it was a great new extra obligation had been heaped on them, right, to take care of this bloody person until their marriage, whereas previously they were going to get rid of them at the age of 18. Right? This is a new deal. This is an extra burden they're being foisted on them, and needs a further story, hopefully of the same kind as the initial burden. So it's not. It's a big expansion. It's not just a specification of the precise means by which you should discharge the obligation. So this kind of variation can't be justified in the way you might justify summoning the police. And also, we don't have this in the case of summoning the police. If you help out and you intervene yourself and you don't summon the police, then you're not wronging the guy, right? You know, because if you effectively help him, you're wronging the system. So we get this. If you violate the conventional specification, it's a moral prohibitor. But there's no structure like that if you move to Italy and don't take care of your parents until they're dead. It's not that you're violating the moral prohibitor part of your obligation. Therefore, it's not a wrong of the parent; it's a wrong of the system. That's not how they think of it. All along the line, it's a wrong of the parent. So this is not going to work either. Right, so we have a problem. We have these wrongs, which have this peculiar character. They look like mala prohibita, but on the other hand, they also look like mala in se, and we haven't been able to capture them by going complicated. So how are we going to do it? So how are we going to capture the intrinsic aptness and the distinctively interpersonal character of family bonds of family loyalty? So here I want to introduce a general idea which has application, I think, in other cases, but I want to apply it here in order to solve the problem. And that's the idea of a normative interest. So here the idea is this, to put it very crudely and implausibly. There are lots of goods in human life which are fundamental. So knowledge and pleasure and love and affection and friendship, perhaps. And many people now think, more than did previously, that you can't reduce these to some one good like pleasure. There's just a kind of list of them. And what I want to say is we should add to that list, and we should add things like rights and obligations to that list. That they're actually on the list. They make your life go better if you have certain kinds of rights and certain kinds of obligations. It's not just about what happens to you. It's about what norms your life is governed by. And your life goes better if there's a certain normative structure in place, just because of the structure, just because of the norms. So now I'm not saying that's there's nothing further to be said about why or when. Right? So with lots of goods, it's all about context. So pleasure is great, but pleasure at your father's funeral is not great. Right? So it's all about the context in which it occurs, and it may very well be, and will be for the case of my examples, that obligation is good because it occurs in a certain context, a certain kind of relationship which has a lot of other stuff going on in it. In particular, family relationships, parent-child relations are the kinds of we're familiar with. And it's because all that other non-normative stuff is standardly going on that the normative stuff is good, has its own value. But it does have its own value. It's not just an instrument to the other stuff. That's the idea. So we have our life goes well because people help us, because they take pleasure in and admire us and so on. It also goes well because we're bound to them in certain ways, because we're obliged to help them and they're obliged to help us. Obliged, not just about the help, it's about the obligation. So that's the hypothesis. So now the thought is this, pertaining to this, that you need the idea of a normative interest as an element in the mixture of interests that are being serviced in order to get the right normative structure in these cases. We've been basically operating with two ideas, and we need three. We've been operating with the idea that a thing might be prohibited because it's intrinsically bad. We've been operating with the idea that a prohibition might be a good thing because it has desirable consequences. And what we need is the idea that a prohibition, a convention, might be a good thing for its own sake, because it creates certain rights and obligations that are good for their own sake. Right? That's the middle way, the extra element. So let me try and illustrate this by looking at a particular case, the case of higher education, which is very, the financing of higher education, which is very topical in England at the moment, perhaps also in Canada, and ask what kinds of interests are in play, what kinds of interests are we trying to serve when we set up a system for the financing of higher education. Well, there are two very obvious interests, which no one will dispute, I take it. The first is the interest of the recipients in having an education that will, if they're capable of taking advantage of it, enable them to participate in a modern society and earn a high salary and all the rest of it. So they have an interest. And the second interest is an interest of society in having a cadre of highly educated people. And a modern industrialised society needs such a cadre. So we all have a collective interest in there being such people, even if we are not ourselves one of those people. And systems for financing of higher education tend to differ depending on how they emphasise those two different interests. So a more socialistic system will emphasise the social interest and think that the burden ought to fall primarily on society, and perhaps a more individualistic system will think the main benefit is going to the person who gets the education, therefore they ought to pay rather a high proportion of the cost. But there generally be, in America, certainly there's a mixture of the two, Pell Grants and so on, so there's an acknowledgement of the social interest. Now, my point is not to dispute any of that, but just to say that's not going to do those two things, however you mix them up, are not going to do the job. They're not going to capture the idea that in the eyes of many people, it is a point of loyalty to their children to help them with their college education, to their children to help them with their college education. And they are being disloyal if they do not help within their capacities and all the usual qualifications. They're not meant to starve in order to put their children through college. It's a very solemn obligation in the eyes of many parents. And I don't think we can capture it by reference to those two interests I've just put on the table. They're not going to give us the right structure. We need this third idea that in the context of family life, it is good to have certain kinds of obligations, to be obliged to help your children in various ways. And that's part of the good of family life, to be bound to people. And they are there, and in return, of course, they'll be bound to help you in your old age, and so on and so forth. So it'll be a reciprocal thing. But these are obligations. It's not just the idea, sure, everyone's going to agree. It's a nice thing if parents help their children through college because it's so important and so on. But the question is, why should it be required? Why should they be wronging their children? Why should they be disloyal to their children if they don't do it? Why isn't it just a very nice thing to do? And the answer, I suggest, is because one of the goods here is the obligation, is the fact that if you don't do it, you would be wronging them. And if they don't do various other things, they would be wronging you. That's part of what people value about these connections. And if you concede that, then you throw that into the mix, and then you get the right normative structure. Then you get the personal bond. Then you get the idea that, okay, we have to distribute the costs and burden benefits of higher education. How do we do it? Well, we acknowledge the social interest, we acknowledge the individual interest, we also acknowledge this interest in having this bond in the context of family life. And we give this bond content by reference to the other interests. So the social interest in having a cadre of educated people feeds into the context of this bond and makes it an obligation to provide them with a higher education. Right? So the two interests interact to deliver this parental obligation. So you throw this into the mixture and you get the right normative structure. You get the idea that there's intrinsic value in this prohibition, and the idea that it primarily, not doing it primarily wrongs the other party and not the system. Okay. So I think this generalizes, hopefully. It's not just about the examples again. I could have talked about friendship, could have talked about neighborliness, the kinds of obligations you have to your neighbors. There's lots of relationships where the relationship essentially includes obligations. It's not just about you have reason to do it or it's nice to do it. You're actually required to do it, and the other person's going to resent it if you don't. And so that's the form of the relation. I want to explain the form by saying there's an interest in that. You don't just have an interest in the exchange of goods and services, in getting help and support. You also have an interest in it being the case that such things are required of the two parties. That's part of the value. So these normative interests explain the deontic form of these relationships. They also explain the content of these obligations to some extent, though this is something I'm a bit more unsure about. So I think there are quite a lot of cases where, suppose my mother is rather far advanced with dementia, with Alzheimer's, and really doesn't recognise me very much. And really, as far as practical concerns go, it doesn't really matter whether it's me that's taking care of her or a rest home. And perhaps, it's not that I'm going to kill her, but really the rest home will be a bit better at it. And I have the money, so I could put her in the rest home. There are many people who would think that was a bit disloyal to do that, if you could fairly easily do it yourself. Even though it is better done by someone else, it would be disloyal not to do it yourself. Many people have that thought. So there it looks as if the interest in the bond is actually, to some extent outweighing the interest in the substance. It's not completely departing from it. If you're going to kill your mother, then you better put her in the hospital, right? But it's kind of outweighing the substantive interest. So these interests explain the form. They also, to some extent, explain the content of the familial obligations that we have. Okay. So I just want to quickly make 3 clarifications to make it all a bit more palatable, hopefully. So first, I've already said this. Value of obligation may well be context dependent. I'm not saying for the present purposes, since we're not talking about promising, which raises these issues, I'm not saying that obligation as such is a good thing. It's a good thing in the context of neighborliness and family life, and so much other stuff is going on there. And that's part of what makes it a good thing, that other stuff. But the crucial point here is this. It's, what I'm obliged to do for my siblings and my mother and my daughter is to help them. And obviously the value of help is non-normative, right? It's good to be helped, and forget about obligation, it's good to be helped. And it may well be that's crucial to explaining why I have an obligation to help, the fact that help is a good thing, a non-normative good. But it doesn't follow from that the obligation is simply good as an instrument to maximising the probability of help. Right? I mean, if you wanted to do that, you could do something with it. If you thought it was a good thing that people take care of their own relatives, and you just thought that fact was good, you could encourage that by the tax system. You could give people tax incentives, or you could make rest homes prohibitively expensive. Right? But that wouldn't get the idea that there's an obligation here, that you should do it out of loyalty. Right? That would miss out that idea. So it's not just about helping your parents is a good thing. There's also this idea that helping your parents from the motive of duty is a good thing, as a point of loyalty is a good thing. Whereas helping them because the tax system has been carefully designed to give you an incentive, that doesn't get the same effect. Okay, so that's one thing. You may say, well, this is all very, this is a horrible vision of family life, which ought to be about affection and love, and this all sounds like duty and obligation, and what kind of family we were brought up in. Well, it's all true. That is true, actually. But nevertheless, for the rest of you who weren't brought up in a horrible family, I'll say some things. For a start, obligation only, obviously most of the time obligation is not salient in friendship, in family life, but that's because of a perfectly general fact that obligations only become salient when they're the threat of breaching them. And, if family life is going reasonably well, breach is not an issue. But they do become salient when breach is an issue. So the fact that the normal smooth running situation, no one pays any attention to obligation, doesn't show anything, and in particular doesn't show that obligation isn't a crucial component of family life because it's there sitting in the background, which So, and I think, you know, one mustn't be too sentimental about this. People do, when they're required to visit their relatives in hospital or help them move home, that you don't always take a great pleasure in that. And most people don't like hospitals. They dread the idea of going to them. They want to be at the beach and not helping their brother move house, you know. And realistic siblings don't expect you to enjoy helping or have joy at the thought of helping them move house or visit them in hospital. They want you to do it as a point of loyalty in those kinds of cases. They don't expect you to enjoy it. So let's not be too sentimental about family life. Obligation is a pretty important part of it, even if it's there only in the background. And finally, you shouldn't go to, I don't want to go to the other extreme either. I don't want to say that when you find yourself obliged to help your brother move house, that you should somehow enjoy the fact. Right? You won't, probably. And that's fine. What you're meant to value is not the fact that the obligation has fallen due. Right? You're not meant to enjoy that. What you're meant to value and not regret is the fact that if your brother needed your help, you would be obliged to help him. And he would be obliged to help you. That's what you're meant to value. Not the actual falling due of the obligation, which may be dreadfully inconvenient and take no pleasure in that. So it's that normative fact you're meant to value. You're not meant to think, this is the thing which many people might try to sell to me. You're not meant to think, oh, well, we have this wonderful relationship of mutual help and support and phone each other. And unfortunately, we're landed in a system where one's obliged to do that kind of thing as well. And that's a kind of unfortunate and regrettable byproduct of what's really valuable about this, which is the help and support and all the rest of it. If you think that, you're not valuing these relationships in the right way. Part of what's distinctively valuable about them is the bond, is the fact that were you not to phone the guy on his birthday, that would be disloyal. That's part of what's special about the relationship. So contrast with the following case, where, let's say, a total stranger picks up your wallet and returns it, right? Lo and behold. And there you ought to be grateful, you know, and if you can do something for the stranger, you ought to do something for the stranger as a sort of gesture of gratitude, and you would be wronging them if you missed an opportunity to do that. But there's no connection here, and so you shouldn't be pleased that you have that obligation of reciprocation. It would be a bit perverse to be pleased that you have this total stranger, you feel nothing for them. Why should we be pleased that you are now obliged to send them a bunch of flowers or go and help with their gardening or something? There it's all about getting the wallet back and giving them something in return which they will be pleased by. It's not about the obligation, it's not about the interpersonal connection, it's about the wallet, getting the wallet back and giving them a benefit that's equivalent to the trouble they took with the wallet. You might start thinking, oh, wouldn't it be nice, isn't it nice that I have this kind of connection with this person that I'm obliged to? But then you're looking for something other than, then you're looking for a relationship. Then you're starting to think of them as a neighbour or a friend, and you're entering into one of these normative interest type of relationships, where part of the point of the relationship is to have the bond. Okay, so I'm hoping you can deal with the normative structure I've been talking about by acknowledging that convention can have non-instrumental value, because these obligations, which are created by convention, they're all conventional: friendship, family, neighbourly, they're all created by convention. They have their own value and their own non-instrumental value, and that can explain the distinctive features of these wrongs. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks very much, David. Martha.
Thank you very much. I was struck by the fact that the central character in your story was an adult with an aging parent and a mature child. And this was all in the context of conventional family relations, which vary from societies to society. And you were sort of talking about how departures from the conventions of society give rise to this notions about what are the obligations of this adult with the aging parents and the mature child. And it struck me that departures from conventional family arrangements make me think also about the obligations of the aging parent and the immature child about their wishes and views. Not all Italian boys maybe want to live with their parents. And then there are other third parties as well involved in this mix. And there are obligations and views and wishes of these third parties. So I don't really have a question. I just sort of was thinking about this as you spoke, and I just wondered if you had any comment.
So I wasn't thinking that Italian parent was. I mean, I don't know what the situation is. Maybe it's not this way. I wasn't thinking that the adult son or daughter was obliged to live in the parents' house until marriage. Maybe they are. That would be very interesting.
But then maybe society would be, oh, here's his family, and they're not following the social norms.
Yes.
There could be different explanations for this.
Yes.
I was just interested that you were focusing on the obligations of this adult with the aging parents and
Yes.
the child, and maybe the brother, and maybe a neighbor.
Yes.
Rather than looking at sort of the whole picture and the interactions between all these parties and their obligations and how that affects the central actor's obligations and so on.
Well, certainly, so people have non-familial obligations, and they have obligations to different family members, and these can conflict, and they somehow weigh them up in a way that's very mysterious and hard to describe. So I was abstracting from that complication. And the reason I was abstracting from that complication is I don't think that's because I was trying to focus on something that's special to family obligations, because the general problem of having conflicting obligations is a general phenomenon in human life. It applies to all obligations, even the most basic non-conventional obligations can, in my view, conflict, and certainly conflict with conventional ones. And it's not at all obvious that if I have a non-conventional obligation not to touch you without your consent, it's not at all obvious that should outweigh conventional obligations to help my children in all circumstances. So we constantly have this problem of weighing different obligations against one another, and I don't know that will necessarily play out differently in the class of obligations that interested me. So I was trying to abstract from that conflict of obligation problem and focus on things which I hope were distinctive to this class of obligations.
Over here, please.
I think I agree with much of your perspective, perhaps not quite all, of your treatment of particular cases. But I was a little puzzled about the general framework into which you were trying to fit your treatment of these cases. Now, taking my cue from the title of the paper, and this
Yes.
may be not exactly the way to do it, because I may be reconstructing incorrectly what the broader moral of the paper is. It seemed to me that you were perhaps wanting to draw a fairly sharp distinction, at least in some context, between convention independent considerations that determine the wrongness of action and the obligatoriness and the moral necessity on the one side, and on the other, convention generated or convention dependent considerations.
Yes.
Hence the title.
I was doing that.
Right?
Yes.
Now, it seems to me that, at least on a certain, not I think implausible way of drawing that distinction,
Yes.
but we can allow for also overlapping cases as you do,
Yes.
rightly.
Yes.
It seems to me that it's perhaps problematic to suppose there are any cases of conventions that are not partly governed by convention-independent considerations. Because, especially if the convention-independent considerations include considerations having to do with the moral permissibility
Right. Yes.
of conduct.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Because it looks as though conventions can
Yes.
only be defensively constructed
Yes.
in what might be called morally protected space.
Yes. Yes.
Right?
Good. Yes.
Uh,
Right.
Otherwise, we get all sorts of crazy conventions and conventional rules that it's not
Yes.
plausible to generate any interesting obligation.
Yes.
Uh,
Right.
But of course, if there are no cases of conventions
Yes.
that on their own generate obligations, on their own generate rights, on their own generate moral and make it the case that certain actions are wrong, because there always has to be some, perhaps background, appeal to convention-independent considerations.
Yes, I think that's okay. I mean, we're focusing on my definition of mala prohibita.
That's really, I know.
Yeah, good, right, yeah. So the thought was there that as long as the following is true, you get the distinction I was setting up. That the wrongness of the mala prohibitor is not dependent on the wrongness, the non-conventional wrongness of the thing prohibited. Right? So it's just the thing prohibited. It may be dependent on all sorts of non-conventional stuff. In fact, I said desirable consequence. Well, most things are desirable pre-conventionally, you know. It's not a matter of convention that pleasure is desirable.
Exactly.
So I think the distinction goes through even given...
But that's because you narrow it.
That's what I narrow it.
And that's fine.
Yeah,
that's fine. That's really why my worry was about some broader construal of what you're up to, because on a broader construal there's an objection.
Yes, sure.
But even so, even on a narrow construal, given what you say in your discussion of familial obligation, familial arrangements, in the non-core areas, you seem to want to lean heavily on the non-instrumental value of loyalty.
Yeah.
Right? Now, leaving aside questions which can be dealt with, though it takes a long time perhaps, about when loyalty is even non-instrumentally valuable. Because of course there are forms of loyalty that are not valuable at all. I don't think loyalty as such is not a value. It's only when you specify the objects of loyalty, etc., that you can carve out space for loyalty. But assuming that's done, even so, in the context you were invoking the notion of loyalty, the value of loyalty, it looks as though that is not a convention-embedded notion, but a convention-independent notion.
Oh, really? Okay.
That is, that competing conventions for the regulation of family life in these non-core areas would have to be assessed, given the loyalty story, in light of the contribution they make to effectively recognizing the non-instrumental value of loyalty.
Yeah, okay, good. So, so I agree that that for the sake of argument, our normative interests are not created by convention. So it's a fact about human beings that it is good for them to form one on a menu of kinds of relationships which are possible. Okay, but only some of those. So many forms of friendship are good for people, but only some of those friendships exist. So only because the relevant conventions haven't been created. So it's true. It's a pre-conventional fact that if this form of friendship existed, it would be good for me. That fact is not a product of convention. But I won't get what I have an interest in unless there are certain conventions. So for instance, if I have an interest in it being the case that I'm obliged to phone my friend on his birthday and he's obliged to phone me on his birthday, no one has that obligation until we've got into the habit of doing it. And I don't have that at birth to anyone, right? Okay. So you've got to have the habit. And then the idea is that, or the convention, and then the idea is there's a pre-conventional fact, which is that convention is valuable, but the value isn't realised until you actually get the convention. And that's all very different from the murder case. The wrongness of murder is not about any of that.
The conventional rules here are crucial. They contribute to the judgment about the defensibility of the family arrangements in these areas. But they don't suffice on their own to generate.
It's not so much the defensibility. I mean, there are lots of defensible forms of family arrangement.
But there are some unacceptable, though.
Yes, sure, that's right. They're
unacceptable.
And unacceptability is not conventional. It's the product of the normative interests, which are not conventional.
Right.
So we don't have an interest in blood brotherhood or systems of vendetta or whatever, from the conventional examples. Okay, but there are many, many forms of family life which are perfectly good. The vast majority do not bind anyone, and that's because we don't practice them. We don't have that form of family life. Right? So we need the convention to get the obligation, even though the interest in the convention is pre-conventional. Right. So,
oh, yeah, well, thanks. This is really interesting. I wondered, you were very sneering about love, etc.
Yeah.
And you preferred vocabulary of bonds, burdens, loyalty. And I can't help but think, though, that love really is quite crucial for your family example.
Yes. Okay.
But the worry is that you don't really love your child. And indeed, if you really do love your child, maybe sometimes you should not be the person looking after the child if it's reckoned in the best interest of the child. You know, there's that corny Hallmark poster about with butterfly, love it, let it go.
Yes.
So our obligations are a way of expressing our love, and those obligations take various social forms.
Right.
And so the Italian mother will be thought to not really love her son if she doesn't continue to have him in her house.
Yes. Yes.
So I guess I'm surprised that you just dispatched love so summarily. Maybe you went off to a harsh British public school.
Brought up in the public nursery.
So,
right, yes.
I
Okay.
mean, and that's a good example too, of course, British public school system, where people say, British parents can't really love their children if they send them off to school, and then British parents will say, no, indeed, it's because I love my child.
Yes.
So this whole idea of having to actually discharge the obligation yourself,
Yes.
I think many people would say is not really at the core of it.
Yes. Look, part of the difficulty here is with the notion of love. I mean, it really is such a broad notion.
Well, that's why your family example, I think, is a very messy example to
Yes.
deal with.
Yes, right.
Unlike
So
maybe other
yes.
kinds of domains of interest might be tidier.
I mean, I think, you know, the question, one of the many interesting questions raised by what you said, but one question is this: is acting out of love really inconsistent with acting out of duty? Right? So suppose my brother's in hospital, okay? And I hate hospitals, like many people. They disgust me, and he's had some horrible injury and so on.
Hospital.
Yes, no, right, but this is the question. I go there, and if you ask me why I was doing it, I might say, out of loyalty to my brother. I might say because I love my brother. Now the question is, how different are those two things? It might be crucial to the explanation of why I go that I feel an obligation to go, that I think it's a duty of family life to go. Now the question is that a different kind of explanation from, it's certainly a different kind of explanation from some romantic attachment. I rush to the date because I'm, you know, besotted with the person. That's a completely different case. But is the kind of love we expect of family life and think the value of family life depends on so distinct from acting on the motive of duty? That's what I'm not clear about. Certainly in the romantic love case it's different. You don't not expect to rush to the date because you feel obliged. But what do you think? Is family
Well,
not...
I think that the brother in the hospital will be looking forward to the visit from the well brother, thinking this brother loves me and hence will come. Now, if they do not get on too well and that love is a dodgy proposition, the brother might nonetheless, as you are suggesting, feel an obligation to go to the hospital. But I think we would think that when siblings act out of obligation only, that's some kind of, shows some shortcoming in the relationship.
So I put it slightly differently. I thought the essential part of the explanation of why they do it is a sensible obligation. There might be other things going on there, but as long as an essential part of the thing is the sensible obligation, then I think I've got my foot in the door. Right? So the situation is obligation. Hospitals are so dreadful that if I didn't feel a sensible obligation, I wouldn't go. Does that deprive the visit of its distinctively family value? There may be other things going on, but it's a necessary condition that I feel the bond of loyalty. That's what I want, and I'm not convinced that would deprive the visit of its value. That he'll come because he has to. That's a natural thing to say, isn't it? Because he has to. He's my brother, and he knows that. I can value that, and perhaps I wouldn't value it if that's the only thing that ever went on between us. But yeah, it's hard because one needs to do things I haven't done. They work out what's distinctive about the motive of duty and how it might differ from other motives that do these things.
Jean.
Hi, sorry, thank you for doing so. So I'm very sympathetic to the conclusion that conventions have intrinsic value. I'm just not sure. I'm having a little bit of doubt about how the value of convention is supposed to relate to the bonds.
The bond. Okay.
Yes, and so for example, to pick up on Christine's point, I wonder whether the feeling of loyalty you have, the feeling of going to hospital to when you really don't want to, but you're acting out of a sense of duty, that looks very much like there's a moral duty there, because that's how we distinguish moral duties from inclinations, right? But you could also feel, it might be the case that loyalty is just an emotion that's part of love, right? And that felt loyalty is something that you just feel to people that you love. That when you love someone, you understand that you have to do things for them that you otherwise wouldn't do. And that relationships consist of this kind of longer term construction of many, many, many events, right? And that, so it seems to me that on your story, the value of the convention holds if the felt loyalty is a kind of internalization of the norm established by the convention. So if then it's true that the convention has had that value because it has helped to establish the bond. But it's not clear to me that it isn't possible that felt loyalty would just exist affectively and still create a sense of duty, a strong sense of duty. That, like, it's not clear to me that you wouldn't feel a duty that would conflict with something you otherwise wanted to do.
Right.
Because of your long-term interest in the relationship and your love for the person.
Oh, I see. So we don't need the background of convention. We just need
I'm not sure. And the thing is, it might be the case that, like, I just don't know how you would know. Like,
yes.
You could have the same feeling of, it seems to me that a lot is turning on, in your account, on loyalty and the fact, the role of the convention in constituting bonds of loyalty. But I'm not convinced that loyalty isn't itself something that arises naturally when a relationship builds up, right? Like, a relationship isn't just, it's not a transaction. So that's why I'm not really convinced by the analogy with the strangers on the street and the helping and all those kinds of things, because, I mean, maybe the reason why I feel an obligation to my mother is because she cared for me when I was young, and I feel a sense of reciprocity for those things, plus I feel affection for her because there's a natural bond of affection there, right? There's natural love, plus there's a sense of I'm best positioned to care for her because...
So why do these things vary so much then across societies? That makes it sound as if it ought to be pretty uniform. Because all the things you've described would apply in Italy, in China, and...
Well, it seems I guess the bottom line of my question really is, because it comes out in the breach, right? So if I betray my mother's entitlement to my care when she's old, it might be the case that, like, who does she complain to? She complains to me, right? And but then you might think, well, that's because everything turns on extremely context-dependent features of the relationship within the society. So it might be that what the society expects in terms of how you generate reciprocal relations, the kind of status that caregiving has in terms of generating obligation, all the individual little particular features that go into creating a relationship. It might be that in certain societies, those have certain status in generating moral obligations. And you wouldn't, because it wouldn't be the case that if my mother feels like I've betrayed her, then she would then complain to other people. Well, do something about this. My daughter isn't. She would say, look, I've taken care of you, right? Look what I did for you. Like, I loved you when you were young. It seems to me that the kind of bilateral quality of the relationship points in the direction away from the convention. It points to the fact that these are obligations that arise distinctively out of the relationship, rather than the other way around, rather than the relationship being partly constituted by these obligations. Or that the kind of affective, behavioral features of the relationship where I love my child, so I care for my child, and my child loves me, and then he notices that I've cared for him, and he wants to. So there are all these things that build up, and the obligations are kind of layers in that process of building up over time.
Right. Well, I mean, this is interesting, but I struggle a bit to see how it's going to cope with huge conventional variation, or huge, let's not say conventional, huge variation. So there are all these people across the world who have this relationship with their offspring, let's put it neutrally. And often it's of great emotional significance, sometimes it isn't, and they evolve in It sounds as if you've given us a template for the evolution of a parent-child relationship, which you say, plausibly enough, will deliver certain normative results and certain normative consequences. But, so are we to suppose that in China, the psychological, non-conventional facts about how Chinese mothers relate to their children are different in a way we can understand independently of convention, and then those explain why Chinese conventions of family life are so different from that's what you'd have to say, I think. To
Yeah, but for one thing, I'm not so convinced that the conventions are that far apart
Oh,
in
okay.
terms of
Good,
what they
okay.
actually require. Like,
Right.
I'm not sure that, like, there's some time, there's a question of whether the parent has to reside in my house or not. But if I put them in a nursing home and I never go and visit them, and I never, like, I don't include them in my family, and I don't have any contact with my grandchildren, even in, well, Canada or Britain or some cold individualistic society, I still think other people might blame me, right? So I think that these are degrees within the same spectrum, and I'm not sure that some of it isn't explainable by the quality of the residential care system, the obligations on parents to work outside the home, and how difficult it is to have parents living with you. You know, I mean, I think that I'm not sure that the variation is that great and that it's so inexplicable in terms
Yes.
of those things. And I'm also just not sure that the parent-child relationship is so different from a friendship relationship, where it would be very odd if my friend complained to other people that I had betrayed the norms of friendship, where it wasn't related to some other norm, like promise or some other kind of agreement.
I don't agree with that,
I
actually,
would
but
say, like-
that would be a big discussion.
Okay.
There you go. But I mean,
But some things are relationship specific, is what I'm saying, right?
Oh,
Like,
sure.
In our
Oh,
relationship,
absolutely.
like,
Yes.
and if
Yes.
my mother complained that
Yes.
I wasn't taking care of her when she was old, I might say, well, she was really mean to me when I was young,
Yes.
and that might, then people might go, oh, okay,
Yes.
well.
So let me say something else of the different. The way it often works is this: in society you have normative packages. Right? Think of neighbours. This is a nice example taken from Joseph Raz, so I ought to footnote it. Yeah. Okay. So the way it works is this: you don't make your own package to a great extent with neighbours. If you start the business of talking to them over the garden fence, right? You are obliged to carry on listening to next week you'll have to listen to the fact that their son got lost in the Atlantic Ocean or whatever it might be. and if they start to enter into a babysitting relationship, they offer babysitting, then the fact that you've had that conversation earlier, it means that you're more obliged to agree to the babysitting relationship, right? So there's a package deal here, and if you buy a little bit of the package, you're expected to buy more of the package. And the package is not fixed by you or by anything you've done. It's not fixed by the individual evolution of your individual relationship. It's the social significance of talking to someone over a garden fence about a personal matter. That immediately means that you're obliged to do this, that, and the other, regardless of the personal evolution of the particular relationship. And that's how friendship is. You know, if you become someone's friend, you don't get to pick and choose, to a certain extent. You do get to pick and choose to some extent, but there's lots of stuff. You can't just decide that our friendship will just consist in calling each other on their birthday and nothing else. Okay, that's just wouldn't be a friendship. So there's a lot of social stuff here which is not under your individual control and not a function of the individual psychological development of the connection between you. It's a package, and the justification for the package is just that package is a good thing. It's a good thing for people to be embroiled in that whole package, all of it. That's that, right?
Okay, there's 4 of the people on my list. I'm one of them. Chris is another. Raul and Wanjuru. So, how to proceed?
You can't ask a question.
Yeah, so the chair's prerogative is to ask a question. It's also the chair's duty not to privilege himself.
That's the package,
So usually I just put myself on a list and I say I'll come up when I come up. But
You've
then
asked your question, your time's up.
that was a statement. So how about 3 of us are also going to suffer with David on that list. So the one who, actually you are too, if this doesn't work. I'm wasting more time. So I'm just going to go in order. Chris, if you can keep it short, and then I'm next, and then Raul.
I'm going to ask your question, so it's okay. So we have a worry about the relationship between the difference between Malin-Say and Malaprahimana and the role of correlative or directed obligations. And it comes out in the in the rejection of the possibility that bonds of family are conventionally specified malum in se.
Okay, right, yes.
So I take it that I can think of a malum in se that's not directed. So I take it it's pre-conventionally wrong for me to destroy beautiful works of art.
Let's say so, yeah.
And I don't think that I owe that obligation to anybody.
Okay.
And so we prohibit it, right? And I think conversely, a lot of people think intellectual property is conventionally justified because of its benefits. But the structure of intellectual property is precisely that if I copy your book and sell it to somebody else, I'm wronging you. Not just wronging the convention. So it seems like, just pre-intuitively, it seems like there are both malum in se that don't have the directed structure and malum prohibita wrong that do have the directed structure.
Yes.
And the word, so we can discuss that, right? But
Yes.
a lot rides on it in your rejection of the
Yes.
conventionally
Yes.
specified malum.
Yes.
Because otherwise, you might think, yeah, we have this duty of loyalty, and it's wrong to be disloyal to your parents, and then things change.
Yes.
And so the two things that you said to reject that were, well, you take a British person and bring them to Italy,
Yeah.
and they say, oh, this is a new, extremely burdensome obligation. But it seems like, well, they only think that it's a new, extremely burdensome obligation because they've been brought up in a different conventionally specified system.
Yes.
But both the Italian teenager who's kicked, whatever, in both cases, the parents who kick their children out too early understand themselves to be committing roughly the same sort of wrong, right? The wrong of disloyalty.
Yes.
And so there's a question about how the extent that the convention specifies that.
Yes.
And so that doesn't seem on its own enough to tell me why conventionally specified malum in se is right. And then so
So you asked
then
four
everything.
questions.
No, so here it comes. So then it just goes back onto the directed
Yes.
obligation bit. And
Yes.
I didn't see sort of
Yes.
at a more abstract conceptual level why that's supposed to be tied to the original distinction in the way that you think it is.
Right. Okay. So see if I can remember the point. So the last point about conventional specification. I mean, I think it is hard to state this point, but I think intuitively, as we say in philosophy. You say that in law school?
We do.
We do, yeah, okay. There's, you could say in a broad, if I suddenly magically, as a godlike figure, made it the case that everyone was obliged to step in until death in order to help people who are being attacked in the streets, never mind, at only a little risk to their own life, that would be a major expansion of the obligation. It wouldn't be a specification of it, right? But nevertheless, it would be the same kind of obligation in certain important senses, have the same structure, have the same general justification, the interest in the person not being killed.
Uh-huh.
So I don't think the mere fact that it's the same obligation in some
Sure,
sense
okay.
is going to do it. The examples you give, and property is just, as we were talking about, just very difficult to know what's going on there. And in order to give a good answer to your question about intellectual property, I would have to have a much better idea than I do of whether it is fundamentally malum in se or malum prohibita in the normal sense I understood.
Yeah.
And I just don't.
Yeah.
So I'm really confused about that. So
let me just put what's the reason that you want to tie the directiveness of the obligation of it it's being owed to another person to the distinction in the way that you do? Is there something more than just that it's an observation that it seems as though malum in se wrongs are owed to one particular person and malum prohibita wrongs aren't? Or is there a deeper reason why you want to carve the obligation up in that way?
well, the intuitive idea is that with the malum prohibita, the fundamental interest at stake is not particularly an interest of the person you're interacting with. It's an interest. So so if you think of obligation to finance higher education, two ways to think of it. One is the crucial interest here is society's interest in having a cadre of educated people. Then, if you don't do it, the fundamental interest being assaulted is that interest. It's everyone else who's being. Alternatively, you could think it's about this character and his needs to participate in this society.
Yeah.
And so that's the fundamental interest here.
Okay.
And so it's him you're doing down. And those are two different ways to think about
Yeah.
it. And they seem to deliver the different structures.
Right. So it seems that dividing things up that way. I mean, so this is consistent with the idea, but is that until you introduce the idea of a normative interest,
Yeah.
you're suggesting that the only way that you can understand why something is wrong is that it has to be responsive to a particular interest that exists, a non-normative interest.
Yes, that's right.
Right. So
That's
the only
right.
reason these things are wrong
That's
is
right.
either that they're wrong because
That's right.
this kind of
That's
interest
it.
or the other kind of interest.
And it's
And
not-
so there couldn't be a convention. There couldn't be conventionally specified malum in se
Which just
that
creates.
were owed that way because that that would rely on there being such an innocent of interest. That would be the idea.
Yes,
Like, could-
that's it. Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
nice way of putting it.
Yeah.
But your thought is that the law could just, as it were, make it the case that the fundamental wrong was a wrong against the individual.
Yeah, I mean.
But the justification of the law could
Yeah,
still
because
be.
you might think that like games or something work like that, right? That in certain forms of games,
Yes.
the players have whole obligations to one another,
Right.
not to act in certain
Yes.
ways.
But it's the
right?
fun of the game. Though.
Yeah, that makes the game
Okay,
convention,
okay,
right?
good. That's a nice.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you.
I don't think we have enough time to squeeze another question in, I'm afraid. We have about 2 minutes, and most questions and answers have averaged 8 minutes. The longest exchange goes to Jean. So could I invite everyone around the table, please, to thank David Owens for a wonderful presentation.